Another part of the material editor which is now new is displacement mapping, which is part of bump mapping. And let's go ahead and take a look at how that works, because it's very, very cool. So I'm just going to load in a sphere, and we're going to use this as the example just for right now. And I'm just going to position our camera so we can see a nice view of it. And I'm going to go into our advanced material editor just by double-clicking on that thumbnail up there. And under bump maps, we have a depth right now of 1, but we also have displacement mapping next to it. And now this overall depth, controls the overall displacement mapping. Right now we don't really have any surfaces loaded in, but I'm going to go ahead and actually load in a different surface so that we can really see these bumps in actions. And I think the sand should do it justice, so I'm going to click OK. And now we can see the scale of our sand texture. And I'm going to actually go ahead and scale this up a bit, which we can also do within the material editor now. We can adjust its overall scale, which we could not do within the material editor before. In View 5, we had to do it up in the top over here. So let's wait for this to re-render, take a look, and that should be good. We can see the bump map, of course, creates the illusion of displacement, but it's not actual displacement, because we can still see we have a perfect sphere. Well, displacement mapping, what we'll actually do is give us that depth and actually change the physical object. So we're going to change this to displacement mapping, and I'm going to increase our depth to about 1, or actually on 1, and click OK. And let's take a look at the preview render, which actually isn't going to show the full effect. We can see it does affect it a little, but it does not change the actual geometry of the object. For that, we need to actually render it. So I'm going to go up to our render options, set this to final, render to screen, 640 by 480, and click render. Okay, and now our render is completed, and our render time was 5 minutes and 41 seconds, which actually is not bad considering that we have global illumination on, and we're extremely close to a displaced texture. We can see that the actual shape of the sphere has been dramatically changed, and all of the bumps are now actual geometry, so it looks really, really cool. Even though our actual texture is probably a little bit too small for this resolution, it's a little large of a render for this size of a texture, so we should probably scale that down a bit if we were going to do this, and even decrease that bump map down a little. But now we have a very, very cool way of using our bump maps to actually create displacement. So this is very, very cool for any object, and especially for terrains. So if we go ahead and create even a standard terrain now, we can get an extremely cool effect just off of a standard terrain because of the displacement mapping. And even off procedural terrains as well, it even adds even more detail. And that way, your surfaces really reflect more onto your terrain, and by physically changing the actual geometry, you get a much more realistic looking effect. So let's just go ahead and we're going to load in a rock texture for this terrain. And we'll do the complex rock and click OK. Because it's a texture that has a lot of different details into it, and it's a nice mixed material. Okay, so let's go ahead and edit our material, and we are going to actually go to our layers here. And through each of the layers on bump, I'm going to enable displacement mapping, making sure it's on all of them. And once I applied it to the one, it seemed to apply it to the other, so that's very good. And we're going to go ahead and click OK. And we will see a lot larger of a change now along the geometry line once this re-renders in our preview. And then we'll go ahead and do a quick render of that to see what it looks like. Okay, so we can see a little bit of extra geometry in there once that came down. But I'm going to go in here now and do a quick render. I'm going to change this down to 320 by 240 and go ahead and click render. So now we can see all this extra little details that are in here now, just off of a standard terrain, where we have it looking very close to what would be a procedural terrain. So displacement mapping is very, very cool for terrains. but not just limited to. So let's go ahead and close this out and take a look at some interesting looking surfaces and how it reacts with displacement mapping. I'm going to load in another sphere, and let's find a texture for it that looks kind of interesting. So let's go to Tiles and select Paved Road and click OK. Let's just take a look at this. Okay, we can see that we should probably make it a little bit larger, because the scale was 0.2, so we'll move it up to 0.7, and now we can see a much larger piece of the stones. Let's go ahead and click on some of that displacement mapping. And click OK, and now we're going to do a small render of that. And just to make it go a little bit quicker, I'm going to go into the atmosphere editor and actually turn on standard model, just so it renders a little bit quicker. And I'll just go ahead and render that. And what we have now is a very cool looking texture. So we can apply this to any sort of object and just have a really neat displacement map on anything, and it's all relative to the bump. So pretty much any texture that already exists can become a displacement map, and then of course you can create your own knowing that you'll be creating a displacement map, and that makes playing around in the function editor a little bit more fun. And let's go back into the material editor now and take a look at some of the other features available and some of the other tools for displacement mapping. The first thing we have is quality boost, which will obviously increase the quality of our render. We also have force extension, which allows us to actually change how much the bump is manipulating the surface, and actually allows us to adjust that mapping value. So we can bring it down and have some pretty cool looking stuff. We can bring it up a little bit higher and have it more smoothed out. We can also show bumps on saturating displacements, and that's nice to have on for when we have very, very white areas of our surface or very black areas. What will happen is it will just turn into a flat surface. What this will do is put bumps on that flat surface and distract from the fact that it is oversaturated of a bump map. We can also move ecosystem instances. In this case, what will actually happen is it will, if we have it on a terrain or any object where it has an ecosystem on it, it will move the plants and objects and whatever it is you have populated on that material to match the displacement of the bump. So we want to keep that on. And then we also have to add 2 underlying layer bumps. And that's if it is not the lowest displacement map in the tree and you want to move it down, and we have multiple textures. So that's a good thing to have in there, and we can check that on and off if needed. And that's pretty much our displacement map, so definitely want to go around and play around with that, because you can do some really, really neat stuff. Grab some interesting surfaces and just see what the displacement map looks on them, and you can just do some really, really cool stuff.